interested in participating. Rachel Wigington with the Delta Conservancy, Brenda Gaydon and Yair Schaefer with BCDC, and myself organized the workshop. And I want to also take the opportunity here already to thank the facilitators of the World Café. We are hoping to achieve 3 goals with this workshop. First, to learn about the approaches that different regulatory agencies are taking with respect to adaptive management. We're happy to have representatives from the U.S. Army Corps, the San Francisco Water Board, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and me from the Delta Stewardship Council share their agency's approaches with us. The second goal is to communicate with each other. Funders, regulators, and project proponents have different perspectives and thoughts about this topic, and in talking to each other, we all can learn what works well and where improvements may be needed. And third, to maybe move forward by sharing successful approaches and crafting new solutions. Some agencies require that project proponents write adaptive management plans that consider potential management responses. The goal is to improve projects by reducing uncertainties and to make sure that the money spent on the projects, which is often substantial, is spent right. But adaptive management can mean that management actions of a project need to be adjusted if monitoring shows that the outcome is not as expected. And we heard a couple of examples this morning. Depending on how the permits are written, these new management actions may or may not be covered under a permit. Because intentional adaptive management, where projects clearly identify and articulate their goals and the measurable objectives they use to evaluate progress towards those goals, is still relatively new, there are many questions around how to integrate it into the permitting process. Our objective today is not to solve all the problems, but to share information, experiences, and perspectives, learn from each other, and maybe find creative solutions to some of the challenges associated with permitting adaptive management. So the plan is that we will first hear from different agency representatives about approaches to permitting adaptive management. There will be a few minutes for Q&A following the 5 talks, and then Campbell Ingram with the Delta Conservancy will make sure that in our discussions we're considering the wide range of projects and programs in the Delta and Suisun Marsh that should be adaptively managed and that need to go through permitting. After that, we will assemble in breakout rooms for small group discussions and document our thoughts on a whiteboard called Mural. And all workshop participants will have access to that. After the workshop, we will synthesize the contributions and then share the summary with you. So here are the logistics of the World Café. You will all be assigned to breakout rooms. There will be about 8 people. We're still figuring this out, but 7 to 8 people hopefully in each room. If there are just 5, that works too. And each group will be joined by a facilitator who brings a set of 3 questions to stimulate discussion. After short introductions, please determine a note taker who will add notes to the mural, and the link is posted in the chat. After 20 minutes, everybody will be sent back to the main room and then back into a breakout room. So to transition from one breakout room to another, we have to go back through the main room. But the groups will remain the same. Only a different facilitator will join your group and will bring a different set of questions. You are welcome to determine a new note taker at that point. The facilitator will briefly summarize the discussion of his or her previous group, and then your discussion can build on that. And please note, it is very important that you do not click join room when you are being sent to a breakout room. This messes everything up, or sometimes messes everything up. So just be patient and wait. Don't click anything, join or leave room or anything. And you will automatically be moved into the appropriate room. So after then another 20 minutes of discussion, you will again been sent to the main room and back to a breakout room where a third facilitator will join you with a third set of questions. So we have 3 rotations, 20 minutes each. The main room will be functioning as a breakout room, but should you experience technical problems and do not get redistributed to your room, but you're welcome to stay in the main room and participate in the discussion there. If you need any assistance, please just use the chat. We will then meet back in the main room at about 3:20 and conclude the workshop at 3:30. Let me see. There looks like there are no questions so far. Just because our facilitators may ask you to be a note taker, I want to very briefly give you a few hints on using Mural. The best way to add text is with sticky notes. And you can either right-click, like shown here on the slide, and then choose Add Sticky Note, or you can just double-click on the board to add a sticky note, and then just type in words. You can move the notes around by clicking and holding the mouse button down, and to resize the text, you can just resize the note. So it's really straightforward, and the nice thing is we can just add new ideas in different sticky notes and document our discussion, and then everybody has access to it, so can see what other groups have been discussing, and we can build discussions on previous discussions that were had. All right, and now let's start with the presentations. I would first like to welcome Brian Matsumoto with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who is kindly filling in from Jim Maza, who can't be here today, I think.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Let's see. Should I be sharing my screen at this point?
Yes, you have the presentation, right? It would be easiest to share it.
All right, is that coming in?
Yep, can see it. It's not in presentation mode yet.
Let's see. Give me 1 second here.
Perfect.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Brian Matsumoto. I'm a senior project manager in regulatory. I'm taking over for Jim here, who is the division chief, but the San Francisco district covers from the border with Oregon all the way down through portions of San Luis Obispo County. Our division itself is broken down into a north branch and a south branch, and north branch generally covers everything north of San Francisco, and south branch everything south. We do have a Eureka field office that covers the 4 northern counties, including Humboldt, Trinity, Siskiyou, and Del Norte. And I see that Jim has included the operations and readiness division on here also. At one point, the Corps or San Francisco regulatory was under the operations and readiness division, but we branched off from that and formed our own division. But the Office of Dredge Material Management is part of operations and readiness, and they handle very similar projects to regulatory. Our general program goals include protecting the nation's navigation and aquatic resources, and enhancing the efficiency of our program, and providing fair and balanced decisions on all the projects that we work on. General authorities that you'll see us working under include Section 10, which includes navigable waters of the U.S., and those our jurisdiction is as far as Section 10 is concerned, includes any work or structures within those navigable waters. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act includes all waters of the U.S., including adjacent wetlands. And we would permit any projects that result in the discharge of dredged or fill material into those waters of the U.S. And finally, Section 103 is of the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, has to do with the transportation of dredged material for the purpose of disposal in the ocean. And most of those projects run through the DMMO, or the Operations and Readiness Division. As far as our process goes, the first thing that we do is determine if we even have jurisdiction, and that would usually involve a delineation of aquatic resources, if any, provided by, completed and provided by environmental consultants, engineering firm, or if requested, the Corps can also do it. But that typically is based on our workload, and oftentimes it's fairly massive. So the chances that we can get out there quickly are fairly small. Once that's done, we can determine if a permit is needed, and if a permit is needed, what type of permit would cover the project. Typically, projects that would have minimal impact include general permits, which would be RGPs, regional general permits, and nationwide permits, and letters of permission, which for us typically are Section 10 only projects that involve structures, things like boat docks, and smaller projects like that. If it is a larger project that has more than minimal impact and discharge of fill, we would be looking at standard permit, or Section 10 also, if it's large enough, and that would require what we call an individual permit and an EA at minimum. If the impacts are going to be significant, then obviously we need to go through the EIS process. As far as adaptive management in our regulations, that adaptive management for us is defined in the 2008 mitigation rule at 33 CFR 332. And I'll just read it for you. Adaptive management means the development of a management strategy that anticipates likely challenges associated with compensatory mitigation projects and provides for the implementation of actions to address those challenges, as well as unforeseen changes to those projects. It goes on a little further, but that's the general gist. And adaptive management in our regulations is required to have a complete mitigation plan. And it's also an integral part of mitigation banking and in lieu fee projects. Both the interim and long-term management plans should have adaptive management plans within those documents. I should say for us, it's not only compensatory mitigation, but sometimes we'll see this in effect with project descriptions themselves. And so that kind of puts us into where adaptive management fits for us. And as far as permitting, if we need to relook at the project due to various circumstances that may arise during project construction, we would need to look at it and see how the project had changed. And generally, bullet points 1 and 2 talk about if the project has either gotten smaller or larger as far as impacts go. If the impact area is smaller, then it would be much easier for us to work with the originally authorized permit. I should say the same or smaller. If it's larger than what was originally permitted, then we would have to re-review the impacts, and the applicant would either have to seek re-verification of whatever type of permit or request a permit mod if it's an individual permit. For the most part, though, again, we're looking at restoration projects and mitigation monitoring plans where there are adaptive management plans within those that will account for various unforeseen challenges in those plans as they arise during monitoring of those types of projects. That is the actual final slide, but I will say, as far as my experience goes, I am the IRT chair for San Francisco District, which means that I work quite a bit on mitigation banking and some more recent inland fee programs, and that is definitely where the core deals mostly with adaptive management. And pretty much that is about, I would say, 95% of where it fits within core regulatory program. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for jumping in at the last minute. Next, we will hear from Agnes Ferris with the San Francisco Water Board. Agnes, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Let me try to share. Can you see my screen?
Yep. It's just
Okay.
not in
Yeah.
presentation yet.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great. Okay, so again, I'm Agnes Ferris. I'm an environmental scientist at the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I work on permitting, Section 401 permitting and enforcement in Napa and Solano counties. I'm also the Water Board representative on the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, or the BRIT, which was formed to streamline permitting for restoration projects. So just to briefly go over the Water Board's authority, the Water Board has jurisdiction over waters of the state, which is very broadly defined under the Water Code as all surface waters and groundwater. As part of protecting water quality of our wetlands and waters, we also protect their many existing and potential beneficial uses, which include wildlife habitat, preservation of rare and endangered species, shellfish harvesting, fish migration, fish spawning, estuarine habitat, and recreation. Under the Clean Water Act, the state must certify that projects meet water quality standards and are protective of these beneficial uses that I mentioned. The Water Board issues water quality certification for projects that involve fill or excavation and are in or adjacent to waters of the state. And these permits will include conditions or requirements to protect the beneficial uses I talked about. Post-construction monitoring and some form of adaptive management is included in our permits for projects that involve creation or restoration of habitat. So typically this includes restoration projects, but also includes mitigation projects and often bank stabilization projects. Let me see if I can advance to the next slide. Okay. The goal of adaptive management is to give projects the flexibility to respond to changing site conditions, particularly if issues arise or if the site isn't developing as it was designed, and to give projects the ability to implement appropriate solutions. So some issues that might require adaptive management include invasive species, erosion, flooding, and mosquito abatement. How much adaptive management we expect projects to plan for is commensurate with the complexity of the project, the potential for impacts, and the amount of uncertainty with achieving project goals. At a minimum, we expect projects to conduct monitoring and demonstrate they're meeting performance criteria and that the project is functioning as designed. If projects are not meeting their performance criteria, we ask them to evaluate the reasons why they're not meeting criteria and identify corrective actions that will be implemented. As an example, this photo shows a small bank stabilization project along the Napa River, where localized erosion was observed after several years of monitoring. The permit we issued required geomorphic monitoring, and the performance criterion was no excessive erosion or sedimentation that threatens water quality or property. The project team determined that the fallen tree and root mass, you can see in the foreground of the picture, that was left in place when they installed the bank stabilization was actually directing flows to the bank and causing localized erosion. And so the remedy they identified was to remove a portion of the fallen tree and cut it down to the level of the creek bed and leave the buried portions of the tree and root mass in place. They also replaced the small rock, cobble, and gravels on the eroded bank and planted willows. Because this project provided a rationale for what caused them to not meet their performance criteria and identified an appropriate remedy, we were able to provide email concurrence to proceed with adaptive management and didn't have to issue a new permit. For larger projects with a greater potential for impacts to waters of the state or with some uncertainty about project outcomes, we require submittal of a monitoring and adaptive management plan. This plan should discuss any uncertainties in the project design, develop restoration targets or performance criteria, and triggers for potential management action. The idea is that projects will have the information they need to decide whether to intervene and implement corrective actions early enough before any issues become significant problems. So for example, if your project proposes to restore tidal marsh by constructing a levee breach, the project's monitoring and adaptive management plan should discuss whether there's a potential that full tidal action may not be achieved, propose monitoring that will be done to assess the degree of tidal action at the restoration site, and identify a trigger that would inform project managers when it's time to reassess the site's progress and potentially implement corrective actions. So as an example of a larger project, last year the Sears Point project requested authorization to implement adaptive management at their site. So project monitoring had showed that extensive erosion was impeding the establishment of salt marsh vegetation, and if left unchecked, would eventually threaten the stability of their habitat levees and their public access trails. So these photos here show examples of the erosional scarps that formed along about 11,000 feet of their habitat levees after the site was breached in 2015. The project identified the cause of erosion and proposed corrective actions, which included regrading, scarp regrading, placement of bay mud, installation of large woody debris, and planting. Even though the adaptive management involves significant excavation and fill in waters of the state, we were able to provide a letter providing concurrence to go ahead with adaptive management and did not have to issue a new permit or amend the existing permit. Our hope is that this flexible and streamlined process supports adaptive management in the wide range of projects we authorize. To this end, we encourage projects to submit draft monitoring and adaptive management plans, if appropriate, as early in the permitting process as possible so that we can provide early input and guidance. I'm happy to answer questions later, and please feel free to email me also. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Agnes. Very informative. I loved your examples. All right, Jana. Afonso from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the next speaker. Are you ready, Jana?
I think so. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, let me pull this up. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Jana Afonso, and I'm the Assistant Field Supervisor for the Endangered Species Program with the Bay Delta Fish and Wildlife Office in Sacramento. Our jurisdiction covers the Delta all the way through the San Francisco Bay, including Sassoon. So my presentation today is largely going to be focusing on Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, because that's the process where the service analyzes most projects in our jurisdiction. Section 7 consultation is required when there is a federal nexus for a project. So that first bullet there describes what that means. When there's a federal agency funding, authorizing, or carrying out an action that may affect listed species or critical habitat. The term adaptive management does actually not appear in the Endangered Species Act or the Section 7 implementing regulations. Section 7 actually allows quite a bit of flexibility to address different kinds of projects and their effects, which can be good. However, there isn't a whole lot of sort of guidance or direction on how to do that, specifically as it relates to adaptive management. Just as a side note, there is some principles and concepts that we can look to Section 10A1B of the ESA. This is commonly known as the HCP process, which does include more about adaptive management. So we borrow some of those concepts in how we do Section 7. That last bullet there, really the key for this is details that are provided during project consultation, including things like success criteria, effects thresholds, and potential remedial actions. Must also include effects as much as is known or can be anticipated. So the key is if those details are provided at the time that we're working on the consultation, then there's a better likelihood that those management actions and adaptive management actions can actually be included in the effects analysis, and incidental take for any federally listed species could be addressed. So a little more about Section 7 here. Sorry to throw regs at you, but sometimes it's important to kind of see the words to understand what the services and federal action agencies are required to do. So that first bullet there has to do, we call it the minor change rule, and it has to do with when we do a biological opinion on a project, we can't sort of change the basic design or the scope of the project. But we can work together to include minor changes which help implement the project. That second bullet there is regarding monitoring, which is, many of you probably know, is a very important component of the adaptive management cycle. It's very important in Section 7 as well. So this regulation requires monitoring to ensure the amount or extent of incidental take of listed species isn't exceeded. So this can also serve to help us understand what actions are better or worse by the effect those actions have on the species. That last bullet there is regarding reinitiation of consultation if needed, which I'll go into more detail on this next slide here. So if something unanticipated happens in the course of project construction or implementation, or if new activities are identified that would help remediate or help projects function better, reinitiation may be your best bet. I know sometimes it's sort of considered a dirty word for folks that work on projects with us, but I would highly encourage folks to think about it as another tool in the toolbox for helping projects achieve their ultimate goals. So just have a couple of examples here. This is by no means, these aren't the only examples out there, but some that we have worked on in our jurisdiction. The first one being the FAST, which stands for Fishery Agency Strategy Team. So this is a multi-agency team that assesses projects for meeting a required 8,000 acres of restored tidal marsh habitat for Delta smelt. So this came out of the water operations consultation. This right here you're seeing on the screen is an excerpt from the adaptive management approach for one of the FAST projects. So I'm going to read it because it touches on important concepts for how we think about adaptive management and habitat restoration for Delta smelt in particular, but could be applied to other projects as well. So the proposed project here will use an adaptive management approach with objective-driven monitoring. Indicators of functional outcomes from proposed project construction and operation will be measured to evaluate progress toward expected outcomes of each objective and to inform corrective measures if thresholds for action are met. Regarding monitoring, monitoring will address physical habitat, hydrological regime, and water quality, vegetation, aquatic food web, fish community, and wetlands and vegetation. So a couple other examples. Agnes mentioned a few minutes ago that she is on the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, otherwise known as BRIT. This is a fairly new team, was just set up within the past few years to work on multi-agencies working together on project design and permitting. They're doing a fabulous job. And they are incorporating adaptive management as much as possible into projects, and including adaptive management planning, and looking at sort of the landscape level in the Bay Area. So that's a good example. And the last thing I'll mention here is the Department of the Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service is under Interior, has an adaptive management policy. So this could be a good resource for thinking about how our agency and other agencies under Interior approach this topic. And I think, Annika, if it's okay, I can copy this link and put it in the chat box for folks, if that would be helpful.
Yes, please do.
And that's it. That's my last slide. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. And next up, we have Brenda Gaden with BCDC.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm seeing if is my screen being shared?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Just get back up to the top. Okay. So my name is Brenda Gaden, and I work for the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which is
Brenda,
known
really quickly, you're not in presentation mode yet.
Oh, thanks. Thought I was. There we go. Yes, so my name is Brenda Gaden, and I work for the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. Most of you probably know us as BCDC. I am the sediment program manager, meaning that I primarily work with dredge material and sediment issues, but I also have a strong linkage to wetland restoration projects and review quite a few of the larger ones in the Bay. So I'm going to just briefly run you through some information about us. I'm not going to be able to go into a huge amount of detail because we have some pretty complex policies around adaptive management. But first off, I just want to go over our jurisdiction, authority, and policies. So BCDC's jurisdiction goes from the outside of San Francisco Bay, from Point Bonitas to Point Lobos on the Pacific coast side, and then way up to the nearly the confluence of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta along the Solano coast, Solano County area. Our full jurisdiction is on the state level of legislation under the McAteer-Petras Act. The McAteer-Petras Act established BCDC in 1965 and had the staff develop what's known as the San Francisco Bay Plan. The San Francisco Bay Plan implements the enacting legislation as well as provides policies for all of our regulatory actions. In addition to the McAteer-Petras Act, we also have the Sassoon Marsh Preservation Act, which was enacted in the 1970s and gives BCDC jurisdiction over the primary management area of Sassoon Marsh. And along with that enacting legislation, a Sassoon Marsh Protection Plan was also developed that has policies specific to Sassoon Marsh primary management area and our relationship to the secondary management area, which is governed by Solano County. In areas where the San Francisco Bay Plan and the Sassoon Marsh Protection Plan overlap, unless there is a conflict within the policies that are being applied, both sets of policies are applied. If there is a conflict, the Sassoon Marsh Protection Plan policies override the Bay Plan. And then finally, our federal jurisdiction, which is a little funky. We're a state agency, but we have federal authority given to us through the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. And through that, we developed the San Francisco Bay Coastal Zone Management Program. This is applied to federal projects within our jurisdiction and within geographic areas that affect our jurisdiction. So one of the questions was, what does BCDC review as far as projects go? So we do all sorts of different project review in our regulatory program, from hotels along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay and other developments such as offices, to ports, to parks and recreation areas along the shore, to marinas, to big restoration projects or small restoration projects, and public access. Public access and the reduction of fill are two major features of our enacting legislation. And also fun things like bridges. So getting into adaptive management a little bit more specifically, BCDC started working with the concept of sea level rise back in the 80s, but through the early 2000s to mid 2000s, we started working in earnest on policies related to climate change, because we acknowledged through the best available science that the climate was changing and sea level was rising, and it was going to affect San Francisco Bay and the development around the bay. And so in 2011, the San Francisco Bay Plan was amended to incorporate climate change policies. And I'll touch on those in just a minute. Since then, the state of California has issued sea level rise guidance, which is noted by the document on the far right or my left, I'm not sure which it is, which provides the best available science today on the projections for sea level rise. Because of the way we wrote our policies, we were able to incorporate the sea level rise guidance from the state of California in our climate change analysis. And just on the bottom of my slide for a quick little example, this is from a project plan that shows the existing shoreline, the proposed changes in combination with existing sea level, 100-year storm, and storm surge. And so you can see over time, sea level rise continues to change, and looking at projects in comparison to sea level rise, we need to think about how we adaptively manage these types of programs as the elevation of the water changes. In addition, in 2019, as part of our climate change initiatives, BCDC amended its Bay plans to look at fill specifically for habitat projects. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. But going back to the climate change amendment, there were some changes in how we evaluate shorelines that relate to adaptive management. And I've just listed a few of the policies here under the climate change amendment. But it's important to first consider when we're looking at projects, whether it's a large shoreline project that requires a risk assessment. A risk assessment is generally needed when you have a development, a park, a restoration project, something that covers a large area and would be potentially affected by sea level rise. And that's anticipated to be done by the project proponents, and we do have tools available to help them do that risk assessment. Generally, we look at mid-century for resilience. The project usually needs to be resilient to mid-century, and by the end of the century, it needs to be adaptable to rising seas. We also look at enhancing habitat values where it's vulnerable to flooding. So again, habitat exists both in the water and on the land, and we want to make sure that where people are investing in habitat projects, that they are looking at flooding issues as well. It also allows for innovative sea level rise adaptation projects, which is a linkage to adaptive management, as is developing a regional adaptation strategy, which is a planning effort by BCDC. And it does allow for some project exemptions. When we amended the Bay Plan policies in 2019 for habitat, we went first to look at adaptive management and habitat issues with fill, because the science generally has told us that it is likely we're going to have to add additional fill to projects to help them be resilient to sea level rise. The science on habitat was more established at the time than it was for development projects. We're still trying to figure out how to best work with the development projects on sea level rise, but Habitat, it's beginning to become very clear. So the policies throughout the Bay Plan were adjusted to look at habitat projects and how we might incorporate fill. For the first time in BCDC's tradition, we are looking to actually promote or allow fill in tidal waters for adaptation to sea level rise. Previously, BCDC's policies looked primarily at reducing fill to the minimum amount necessary for any project. Again, this set of policies looks for the best available science. It supports further green infrastructure use beyond riprap, which is something that's a little bit more of a boost to the natural resource community. It looks at reliance on adaptive management in an increased way. And this is because we know since climate is changing and habitat is changing, we're in a very dynamic system, and work that we do today is likely to have to be adapted tomorrow. It also, for the first time, looked at adaptive management funding. So initially we had hoped to include a requirement to provide funding for adaptive management, but with pushback from the stakeholder community, we went with a funding strategy. And the idea here is that as a restoration or habitat project is completed, 10, 20 years from now, it may need funding to be adaptively managed. And if that funding is not available or thought about, a habitat project could go by the wayside. And then also, the other last thing that it really did promote is the idea of a well-considered pilot project. So if something hasn't been done before, BCDC is very interested in seeing whether or not things that are trials can be promoted and learned from. And so the idea of doing pilot projects is more welcomed, but still does require monitoring to make sure that pilot projects provide the results that were sought after or that we learned something from them. And just my last slide, or second to last slide here, I would be remiss if I didn't promote the planning side of our office. I've talked about our regulatory side, but we have a very significant planning team that works on adapting to rising tides. That's its general term. They've just recently put out this report, Adapting to Rising Tides, which looks at vulnerability and adaptation throughout the Bay Area. And then there's this very fun tool, interesting tool, the Flood Explorer, where you can go online and pick out different areas of the Bay, look at flooding, look at different scenarios, and kind of run through what you might see in the future at a project as a way to help do that vulnerability assessment. And with that, if you have questions, my email is there. But that is my presentation, and thank you, Annika.
Great, thank you so much, Brenda. I guess I'm up next, and I will talk about permitting for adaptive management from the Delta Science Program's perspective. So our jurisdiction, can you see my screen? I should check on that first. Thanks. No?
Yes, we can see it.
Now we
Oh,
see.
Yeah.
okay, good. Okay. So our jurisdiction, the Delta Stewardship Council's jurisdiction, is the legal delta, which includes Suisun Marsh. And if a project or program needs to adhere to the Delta Plan, we call it a covered action, an action covered by the Delta Plan. Types of projects that are applying for consistency with the Delta Plan include restoration projects such as Dutch Slough, Tule Red, and the Wales Belly Subsidence Reversal Project, mitigation projects such as setback levees and planting berms, and water management projects such as the Twin Tunnels and the Los Vaqueros Reservoir expansion. Delta policies regulate several different aspects of covered actions, including aspects related to water resources, ecosystem restoration, delta place, and risk reduction. The Delta Plan also requires that projects use the best available science and implement mitigation measures as laid out, or better than laid out, in the Delta Plan, and that they plan for adaptive management. With respect to adaptive management, the Delta Plan's policy GP1B4 states that Ecosystem restoration and water management covered actions must include adequate provisions appropriate to the scope of the covered action to assure continued implementation of adaptive management. And the requirement shall be satisfied through both of the following: an adaptive management plan and documentation of access to adequate resources and delineated authority by the entity responsible for the implementation of the proposed adaptive management process. The adaptive management plan should generally follow the 9-step framework and may contain the sections listed here. Guidance and resources for writing adaptive management plans are available on the Delta Stewardship Council's website and through early consultation meetings with Delta Stewardship Council's adaptive management liaisons, of which I am one, and Dylan Chappell is another one, and Karen works in this realm too. The reason why adaptive management is so important is, of course, that there's a level of uncertainty of how the landscape will respond to the project actions. Projects often involve experimental design elements, assumptions about the project site and its responses, and/or elements that are not well studied in the scientific literature. These uncertainties should be spelled out in the adaptive management plan. And one way to determine where uncertainties exist is with the help of conceptual models that model linkages between objectives and proposed actions. An adaptive management response table can then lay out the potential adaptive management responses that will be taken when monitoring results have indicated that a predetermined trigger level has been reached. There are several challenges with requiring adaptive management for the Delta plan consistency that have surfaced over time. One is that the project proponent needs to know and be aware of uncertainties existing in their system. And addressing uncertainties can mean that a project is designed somewhat like a research study, and that requires taking some risks that some element may fail, whereas others may succeed. Funders and project proponents may not be willing to take that risk. Also, individual projects may be too small to address uncertainties by themselves. In that case, learning from other similar projects and sharing lessons learned with other projects can get around this at a system level, but requires communication and coordination. Regulatory overlap can be a challenge when different agencies have different requirements. And finally, monitoring and adaptive management takes resources, oftentimes beyond the timeline of a project. Obtaining funding for monitoring can be difficult in the first place, and securing funding to monitor whether project objectives have been met, which can take several years after project completion, is even harder. So these are just some challenges that have popped up. I'm looking forward to learning about other challenges and even more learning about potential solutions to these challenges from the discussion we'll have next. All right, and that is my talk. And now we have a little bit of time for Q&A. We had originally scheduled 10 minutes, I believe, but we're a little bit behind, so I would like to shorten that. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or raise your hand. That works as well. We had, oh, I see a hand. Let's see. Susan.
Hi,
Please go
Annika.
ahead. Hi.
I'm wondering, among all the different jurisdictions of the agencies and the folks who are here, the knowledge of the adaptive management plans already being carried out, has there ever been an instance of adaptive management plans conflicting with each other? Or better yet, complementing each other?
So this is Brenda Gaden from BCDC. I can sort of answer that, at least from our agency's experience, when we're working on adaptive management plans for projects that are permitted by multiple agencies, it's very frequent that one adaptive management plan is shopped to all the agencies. And so it's the same plan that we all see. It does its best to cover all of our needs. And sometimes there's a few comments back and forth, but usually what ends up happening is all of the needs get into one document rather than having conflicts. At least that's usually our goal.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
Another comment on that is that the IAMIT, the Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team, and the AMAT as well has talks to projects, or as the forum for projects to come and present and get input from different regulators early on to make it easier to combine the documents, so nothing has to be duplicated and they are fitting well together for the different permits.
There's another question in the chat from Karen Kafitz, and I can just read it if you want, since I have it up.
Sure.
And the question is targeted to the Army Corps. So Brian, you're on the hot seat. It says, would you say it's beneficial for projects to anticipate the greatest possible impact and get that permitted? Is that permissible, or must projects only get permitted for their preferred alternative?
So we're talking for IPs.
Yes, individual permits in the core lexicon.
So repeat your question one more time.
It's Karen. This is Brenda, but this is Karen's question, and it says, would you say it's beneficial for projects to anticipate the greatest possible impact and get that permitted? Question mark. Is that permissible, or must projects only get permitted for their preferred alternative?
Well, I mean, what's going to drive that is your basic project purpose, and then your overall project purpose, especially for an IP, because if there's going to be a discharge of fill, you will have to go through the 404 B1 alternatives analysis. And through that analysis, it is supposed to find the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. So ideally, you'll end up with something that has less impacts than your probably your initial proposal.
I guess what I was getting at with the question was, if you anticipate that there are a couple of different possible ways that you might modify your project, could you say, the maximum impact if we made these adaptive management modifications would be X and get permitted for that up front? Or would you have to say, well, we're starting by doing Y, and even though X is a possible impact later, because it's greater than the impact of our first action, we have to wait and go through the process again to get a modification?
Well, I wouldn't say you would be going through the entire process all over again. But, I mean, ideally, again, we would be looking to minimize impacts. And if that is part of the adaptive management plan, it's possible that it could be written into the permit in such a manner.
Thanks. I think that was exactly what my question was. Thanks, Brian.
Are there any other questions? Not seeing any. Let's go to our last talk before we then break out into the breakout rooms. Campbell Ingram with the Delta Conservancy will talk about different projects and programs in the Delta and Suisun Marsh. Campbell, are you there?
I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone. Is my screen up?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. My name's Campbell Ingram. I'm the Executive Officer, Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. I want to thank the previous 5 presenters. That was really helpful for me to see all of the agency perspective one after another. I'm just sorry, I just need to try to move something. Okay, there we go. There was a pop-up against my notes and I couldn't see my notes. So the Delta Conservancy is a state agency and we play a role in doing ecosystem restoration and economic development in the Delta. We require all of our grant applicants to produce adaptive management and monitoring plans. And then that, of course, goes into all the agencies that just spoke about getting those projects permitted. But we want to review those plans and try to make sure that they're sound before we decide whether or not to fund a project. So in my role and in my past roles, I've done a lot of work in the Delta and in the region through time. And so I've experienced a lot of different projects. And so today, I've been asked to really set the stage for the breakout discussions by giving an overview of the types of projects in the Delta and the Sassoon Marsh that have both permitting and adaptive management considerations. And the goal here really is just to encourage you all to consider the great variety of project types as you're entering these breakout groups and how that variation impacts permitting and adaptive management demands. So really, in my mind, the projects vary on 2 major axes. First is the scale of projects, specifically their spatial extent. So ecological restoration projects range from very small habitat enhancements to extensive modifications of existing landscapes. And in our region, obviously, that's on the order of thousands of acres in many instances. So second, projects focus on multiple different habitat types and ecological functions, and these projects may prioritize things like water delivery, water managed wetlands, or even reintroducing tidal action on projects throughout the Delta. So if you look at the map on the right there, this is a map that's just really showing the existence of most of the projects out there in the Delta right now. The orange maps are in Sassoon Marsh. The orange dots are projects that are in planning phase. The green dots are projects that have been completed. And then the teal dots are ones that are actually more in construction phase currently. So obviously with this many projects in play, variation or variability is a given. So both the scale and ecological type have the potential to impact the type and number of permits, as well as the extent of adaptive management planning. So as I overview the types of projects in the Delta and the Sassoon, I'll group them by these ecological type and attempt to provide examples across multiple scales. So starting with some of the more complex water management. So some of the most extensive adaptive management actions in the system really concern the inflow and outflow of water in the Delta. These actions affect landscape scale level processes and have the potential or potentially accompanied by very large infrastructure components. So you can think Delta Conveyance Project here, and even the potential effects of the voluntary agreements moving forward. The salinity control gates in the Sassoon Marsh are really an excellent example of a project with a modest sized infrastructure footprint, but that could be used to adaptively manage salinity across the region of the Bay Delta estuary. And then, further going down the ladder, you have individual projects on duck clubs out of the Sassoon Marsh where individually and then collectively, they're looking at trying to improve water quality of their discharge water and water management on their duck clubs. And in some instances, even trying to provide food resources for the surrounding waterways. Next up, we have tidal wetlands and floodplain restoration. These are highly regulated habitats, and the adaptive management considerations for these projects are extensive, obviously requiring careful consideration of sea level rise, subsidence, and even invasive species. Photograph there on the right is Wings Landing, and it's a tidal restoration project in the Sassoon Marsh, and a great example of a recent project, tidal restoration project. It's really a moderate scale, but it's obviously linked to a various other projects in the system. We have the Yolo Bypass floodplain enhancement efforts, which are looking at enhancing over 17,000 acres of floodplain habitat in the Sassoon Marsh. And obviously the added benefit of increasing flood capacity and providing protection for surrounding communities. And then we have similar projects that have gone on through time in the Cosumnes River Basin, and currently there are planning efforts looking at the San Joaquin River and trying to create a similar bypass structure in the south end of the Delta and the San Joaquin system. Lastly, I really wanted to highlight some of the work that we funded, a wetland revegetation project on the Dutch Slough project, which is an example of a project that's taking place on a very sensitive habitat that doesn't necessarily entail major habitat alteration. So this will have the potential to change the adaptive management and permitting burden for that project. We also do a lot of work on other habitats. So these are projects that really consider the ecological restoration project that take place on sort of more moderate scales and or even less regulated habitats. So riparian habitat, we've done a lot of work through time on the Cosumnes River Preserve and throughout the Delta. And then there are restorations in the Delta for upland and transition habitats between aquatic and terrestrial zone, and obviously at different spatial scales. And they have the potential to provide migration space for sea level rise as we move into the future. So for many of these projects, the scale again might determine both the permitting and adaptive management needs for the project. So we also have a host of multi-benefit projects, and these are some of the projects that aim to provide benefits both for the natural and human communities. We have setback levees throughout the Delta. This one here is pictured on Sherman Island. This is kind of an interesting case because here you have extreme cost, upfront costs, and permitting requirements for actually setting back levees, and which to some extent actually constrains your ability to do much adaptive management. But yet, through some of the early discussions, adaptive management is still absolutely a component of the permitting process. And then we have a whole host of projects in the Delta that are really aiming to improve ecosystem services, such as water, habitat quality, through changes to land use practices. And some such projects provide alternative regulatory pathways for landowners hoping to encourage wildlife-friendly practices. We've got a number of projects like this that we've funded, and again, relatively small scale, but having significant impact. And it's important to be able to understand through adaptive management how the benefits of these projects will maintain in the future with climate change and sea level rise. So wrapping up, one size fits all permitting solutions are extremely unlikely. And so we all come to the table for this discussion from the perspective of our expertise and regulatory as regulators and policymakers and funders and restoration practitioners. And I'm hopeful that we can step out of those silos during the coming discussions and consider cross-cutting solutions, as well as instances where special considerations are necessary. Increased coordination on this issue is obviously going to be critical as we move forward for current restoration, as well as the goals that are set forward in the revision of the chapter for the ecosystem restoration chapter of the Delta Plan, which articulates long-term targets for restoration in the Delta through time. So I hope this is helpful just in setting the stage for sort of the breadth and scale of all the different types of projects that we're considering in the Delta, and look forward to chatting in the breakout groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Campbell. This was a great overview.
All right.
And now comes the time for the breakout groups. We have adjusted the number of rooms a little bit because of the number of participants. And Lauren and Shay, you will actually just get to participate. You don't need to facilitate. So we have 3 rooms less than planned. But Brandon, are you there?